I remember the exact moment my world started to crack. It was a Tuesday evening, and everything about the day had been normal: work, dinner, and the usual evening routine. That is until Madison, my wife of 15 years, walked through the door. There was something different, something intangible yet glaringly wrong. She smiled at me as she set her bag down, but her eyes darted away quickly, avoiding mine. The air shifted, and that's when I caught it, a scent. Not her usual vanilla perfume, but something sharper, unfamiliar, and distinctly masculine. My stomach clenched involuntarily. It could have been from her work, I reasoned. But deep down, a small, unwelcome seed of doubt was planted. "Hey, how was your day?" I asked casually, trying to keep my tone even. "It was fine," she replied too quickly. She began rifling through the mail, her movements unusually stiff. She didn't even come over for our usual kiss on the cheek. I brushed it off for now. But as the evening went on, the uneasiness grew. Madison was quieter than usual, distracted. When I asked if something was bothering her, she waved it off with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. It wasn't like her, and I couldn't ignore the strange scent lingering on her clothes. It haunted me, a specter of suspicion I tried to shake off. That night, as we lay in bed, I watched her while she scrolled absent-mindedly through her phone. Her screen faced away from me, a habit she'd never had before. It was a small thing, but together with the perfume and her odd behavior, it felt like a puzzle piece clicking into place. Something was definitely wrong. I didn't sleep much that night. Instead, I replayed every detail of the evening, every subtle shift in her demeanor. By morning, I knew I needed to do something, anything, to dispel the growing sense of dread. That's when the idea came to me. I would follow her. Not in a dramatic, movie-like way, but subtly, discreetly. I had to know if my suspicions were just paranoia, or if they were something more. And that's how it all began. I didn't know it then, but the truth I was about to uncover would change everything. The next morning, I was on edge, my mind racing with questions I didn't want answers to. Madison seemed calm as she got ready for work, humming softly to herself. It struck me how normal she appeared, how convincing. Maybe I was overreacting, I thought. But then she left the house without saying goodbye, and the nagging feeling returned with a vengeance. I decided to follow her that day. My heart pounded as I slipped into my car a few minutes after she drove off. I kept a safe distance, my palms sweating on the steering wheel. Her car weaved through traffic, and I mentally kicked myself for how ridiculous this felt. Was I really doing this? Stalking my own wife? But the moment she took a turn that didn't lead to her office, my doubts vanished. Madison parked outside a small cafe, one we'd never visited before. She stepped out, looking around nervously, and entered. I waited a few minutes, then parked across the street. From my vantage point, I could see her through the large glass windows. She sat at a corner table, her hands folded neatly, her gaze fixed on the door. And then he walked in, a tall man in a suit, with an air of confidence that made my stomach churn. He spotted her immediately, his face breaking into a smile as he approached. Madison stood, and they hugged. Not the quick, polite kind, but the lingering, familiar kind. My chest tightened. I gripped the steering wheel, unsure whether to burst in or sit frozen in my disbelief. They sat down, leaning toward each other as they talked. Madison's face lit up in a way I hadn't seen in years. They laughed together, their conversation flowing easily. The cafe's cozy, intimate atmosphere made it all feel more sinister. It wasn't just two friends catching up, it was something more. Something I wasn't ready to face. I stayed in my car for over an hour, watching them. The man reached across the table, his hand brushing hers. She didn't pull away. Instead, she smiled, a smile that was once mine. My throat felt dry, my pulse pounding in my ears. When they finally left, I followed them again. He opened the door to his car for her, a small, gallant gesture that made my blood boil. They drove off, and I trailed behind, keeping my distance but never letting them out of sight. They pulled into the parking lot of a boutique hotel on the outskirts of town. My heart sank as I watched them disappear inside. It felt like the air had been sucked out of my lungs. I sat in my car, staring at the entrance, unable to move. This was it, the confirmation I had dreaded. Madison wasn't just slipping away from me. She was actively choosing someone else. I couldn't bring myself to follow them inside. Not yet. Instead, I stayed in the car, battling the storm of emotions swirling inside me. Anger, betrayal, heartbreak. They all fought for dominance. I didn't know how long I sat there, but eventually they re-emerged. Their expressions were relaxed, almost carefree, as if the world around them didn't exist. They hugged once more before parting ways. Madison returned to her car, and the man drove off in his. I followed her home, my mind reeling. By the time I parked outside, the day had turned to dusk. Madison entered the house, her face calm, her movements unhurried. It was as if nothing had happened, as if she hadn't spent the day with another man. I stayed in my car, watching the light in our bedroom window flicker on. She moved about inside, oblivious to the turmoil she had just unleashed in my life. I knew I couldn't confront her. Not yet. I needed more. More proof, more answers. Whatever came next, I had to be ready. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Madison slept beside me, her breathing soft and steady, as if she hadn't shattered the foundation of everything we'd built together. I wanted to scream, to shake her awake and demand the truth, but I didn't. Instead, I stayed silent, letting my anger simmer beneath the surface. The next morning, I decided to dig deeper. Following her the day before had given me answers, but they weren't enough. I needed something concrete, something undeniable. It felt invasive, wrong even, but I couldn't let the doubts consume me anymore. When she left for work, I waited a few minutes before going to her closet. My hands trembled as I sifted through her clothes. Tucked away in a corner was a small bag I'd never seen before. Inside, I found items that made my stomach drop. A lacy red dress and matching heels, neither of which I'd ever seen her wear. There was also a receipt for a luxury spa, dated last week, when she'd told me she was working late. I put everything back exactly as I'd found it, feeling both vindicated and hollow. This wasn't paranoia. There was something real and undeniable happening, and I wasn't about to let it go unchecked. That afternoon, I installed a small GPS tracker under her car. It felt like crossing a line I could never uncross, but I couldn't stop myself. I needed to know where she went when she wasn't with me. It was a desperate move, but desperation was all I had left. The tracker's results came in quickly. Over the next few days, I learned that Madison wasn't just meeting the man from the cafe. She was spending entire afternoons with him. They met at that same boutique hotel more than once, their meetings stretching into the evening before she returned home to me, acting as if nothing had happened. By the end of the week, I had all the proof I needed. Every GPS ping, every photo of her car in the hotel parking lot, every timestamp was like a knife to my chest. But I wasn't ready to confront her yet. Not until I had a plan. I needed to understand why. Why him? Why now? And why risk everything we'd built for this? I decided to follow her again, this time determined to see what was happening firsthand. It was a Saturday, and Madison told me she was meeting a friend for lunch. I nodded, pretending to believe her, and watched as she got into her car. The tracker pinged her location, and I tailed her at a distance. To my surprise, she didn't go to the cafe or the hotel. Instead, she drove to a nearby park. She parked her car, and within minutes, the same man appeared. They greeted each other warmly, walking hand in hand along the winding paths. I followed on foot, careful to stay far enough behind that they wouldn't notice me. As they walked, they stopped occasionally to talk, their gestures animated. At one point, he leaned in close, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. She laughed, a laugh I hadn't heard from her in years. My chest ached as I realized that I was watching a version of Madison I hadn't seen in so long, a carefree, vibrant woman who seemed to have left me behind. But then, their laughter quieted, and their expressions grew serious. They stopped by a bench, and Madison pulled out her phone, showing him something on the screen. I couldn't hear their conversation, but the man's face darkened, his brows furrowing as he looked at her. Madison touched his arm, and he nodded, though reluctantly. Whatever they were discussing, it wasn't just a casual fling. There was something more to it. I felt sick. This wasn't just a betrayal. It was a life being built behind my back. The weight of it was suffocating, and I knew I couldn't keep watching. I turned and walked back to my car, my mind racing with questions and a new sense of resolve. I had seen enough. It was time to confront her, but not in anger or chaos. I needed her to know that I wasn't blind to the truth, that I had been watching as she unraveled the life we'd spent years creating. And I needed to know why. The house was quiet when Madison came home that evening. I sat at the kitchen table, the evidence laid out in front of me. Photos, GPS logs, even the receipt from the spa. My heart hammered in my chest as I heard her keys jingle in the lock. This was it. She stepped inside, pausing when she saw me. "Hey," she said, her voice light, but her smile faltered as her eyes swept over the table. She knew. I could see it in the way her expression shifted, the way her hands trembled slightly as she set her purse down. "We need to talk," I said, my voice calm but firm. She hesitated, then sat across from me. Her eyes darted to the photos, the documents, but she said nothing. "Who is he?" I asked, cutting straight to the point. Madison blinked, her lips parting as if to protest, but she stopped herself. For a moment, I thought she might deny it. Instead, she sighed and leaned back in her chair, her face crumpling. "His name is Eric," she said quietly. Eric. A name to put to the face I had watched steal the life we'd built together. "How long?" I asked, my voice tight. "A few months," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean for it to happen, Michael. I swear. It just did." I leaned forward, the anger I had been holding back bubbling to the surface. "It just did?" I repeated, my voice rising. "You don't accidentally meet someone at a hotel. You don't accidentally lie to your husband. This wasn't a mistake, Madison. This was a choice." She flinched but didn't argue. Tears welled in her eyes as she reached across the table, but I pulled my hands back. "Why?" I demanded, my voice cracking. "Why him? Why now? Wasn't I enough?" Her tears spilled over as she shook her head. "It's not about you," she said, her voice trembling. "It's about me. I don't even know who I am anymore. I've spent so many years being your wife, the kid's mom. She choked on her words. I needed to feel something again, to feel alive." Her words cut deeper than I could have imagined. I had spent years trying to make her happy, to build a life where she felt secure, loved, fulfilled. And yet here she was, telling me that she had found that feeling in the arms of another man. "What about our family?" I asked, my voice breaking. "What about everything we've built?" She wiped at her eyes, shaking her head. "I didn't want to hurt you," she said. "I thought I could stop, that it wouldn't go this far. But then," she looked away, unable to finish. "But then you kept choosing him," I finished for her. The silence that followed was deafening. I pushed back from the table, standing as the weight of her betrayal settled over me like a lead blanket. "You didn't just hurt me, Madison. You destroyed us." "Michael, please," she said, standing too. She reached for me again, but I stepped back. I love you. I do. I never stopped. This wasn't about replacing you. It was about me trying to, she faltered, searching for words that wouldn't come. You love me? I asked, incredulous. You don't do this to someone you love. Her tears fell freely now, but I couldn't bring myself to feel sympathy. I had been drowning for weeks in suspicion, anger, and heartbreak. And now that the truth was laid bare, all I felt was hollow. I need time, I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper, to figure out what comes next. Michael, I can't do this right now, I said, cutting her off. You need to give me space. She looked like she wanted to argue, but she didn't. She nodded, wiping at her cheeks. I'll stay with my sister tonight, she said softly. I didn't respond. I turned and walked out of the kitchen, heading upstairs to the guest room. I didn't even look back as I heard her gather her things and leave. When the door finally closed, I sat on the edge of the bed, the reality of what had just happened washing over me. This wasn't a nightmare I could wake up from. It was my life now, shattered into pieces I didn't know how to put back together. The days after Madison's confession passed in a haze. She stayed at her sister's, giving me the space I had asked for, but the silence in the house was deafening. I couldn't escape the memories, our laughter, the warmth we once shared, all of it now tainted by her betrayal. I spent those days in quiet reflection, weighing my options. Part of me wanted to fight for our marriage, to believe her when she said she still loved me. But the other part, the one that felt the weight of her choices, knew some lines couldn't be uncrossed. Trust, once broken, is nearly impossible to rebuild. When Madison called a week later and asked to talk, I agreed. She came by the house, looking worn and anxious. As we sat down in the living room, she hesitated, as though unsure where to begin. I've been doing a lot of thinking, she said finally, and I know I've hurt you in ways I can't undo. But I want to try. I want to fix this. I studied her, searching her face for sincerity. Why now? I asked. Why does it take this for you to realize what you want? She took a shaky breath. Because I was lost, Michael. I didn't realize how far I'd drifted until I saw what I was losing. You. Us. I know I don't deserve another chance, but I'm begging you for one. Her words hung in the air, heavy with emotion. But even as she spoke, I felt a deep weariness settle over me. This wasn't just about her betrayal. It was about everything it represented. The cracks in our foundation had been there long before Eric came along. I need you to understand something, I said, my voice steady but firm. You didn't just cheat on me, Madison. You cheated on everything we've built. You made a choice, a selfish, deliberate choice, and that's not something I can't forget. Tears streamed down her face as she nodded. I know. I'll do whatever it takes to make this right. But could she? Could I? The truth was, I didn't know, and I wasn't sure I wanted to try. Madison had taken the love and trust I'd poured into our marriage and gambled it away. Even if I forgave her, the doubt would linger, a shadow over everything. I need more than promises, I said finally. I need time to heal, to figure out what I want. And you need to figure out who you are, on your own. Her face crumpled, but she didn't argue. She nodded, her hands trembling in her lap. If that's what you need, I'll give it to you, she said softly. The days turned into weeks, then months. Madison and I separated officially, and while she continued to reach out, I held firm in my need for space. I threw myself into work, into reconnecting with friends and family, and into rediscovering who I was outside of our marriage. Over time, the pain began to dull, replaced by a sense of clarity. I realized that while I still cared for Madison, I couldn't rebuild a life with her. The trust was gone, and without it, our foundation was irreparably damaged. When we finally met to discuss the terms of our divorce, it was a somber but amicable conversation. Madison apologized again, this time with a quiet humility that told me she had done some soul-searching of her own. I wished her well, and for the first time, I felt like I truly meant it. The divorce was finalized quietly, without drama. Madison moved to a new city to start fresh, and I stayed behind, focused on rebuilding my own life. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. One evening, months after the divorce, I sat by the lake near our old favorite spot, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and gold. For the first time in what felt like forever, I felt at peace. My life was different now, but it was mine, and I was determined to move forward, stronger, wiser, and more resilient. Madison had been a chapter in my life, one filled with love, heartbreak, and lessons I would carry with me forever. But it was just that, a chapter. And as I sat there, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I knew it was time to turn the page.